Hello and welcome to Human Synergistics online roundtable event. This is our third such event and very excited to host once more and have the fantastic members joining me today. Very excited. So we have Sabine Gromer here today with us from MagnoliaTree to present, as well as Ali from Bayer, Christian Sellars from Transforming Engagements, and Jochen Grotenhöfer from Transition Consult. So we have some time today and we'll be hearing all sorts of different insights and perspectives on human synergistics tools, how they're used, the benefits of reliable, valid measurements for the purpose of development, and again, best practices for implementing positive, sustainable change for leaders, teams, and organizations. So I'm very happy to have the time to discuss this topic with you today. This is going live, so anyone who's joining us, first of all, thank you very much for your participation. Also, you can enter comments and questions into the chat, so we'll be trying to keep an eye on that as the session progresses. So please feel free to add your comments and input along the way. We look forward to that. A great opportunity to ask your questions about leadership development, culture development, and so on from the experts today who make that kind of wonderful work a part of their day-to-day careers. So we have a fairly flexible roundtable format today. We'll see a variety of topics. I'll just switch to our agenda. So after my brief introduction, we'll be hearing first from Jochen Grotenhöfer talking about how human synergistics tools connect with other adjacent models and concepts, always something very helpful to bridge the gap between what human synergistics is all about in our models and how clients utilize that. And then we'll continue through our timeline. This will be, again, a roundtable structure, so we'll bring each presenter on one at a time, hear from them, and then bring all of our presenters on around the table to discuss. And that will then transition into the next topic. So we're hoping for a flexible, dynamic, and participative experience. So very happy for anyone in the audience who's joining us again to feel free to add your questions in the chat to discuss. All right, we're also recording this as well, so we'll be posting parts of this on our website for future reference. So if you saw things today in the session that you're particularly interested in or would like to share with others, please feel free to come to our website, humansynergistics.com. There under resources, you'll be able to find these videos as well as many others on topics of development. So please feel free to leverage and access that resource. All right. Well, I think with that brief introduction, then I think we can take our first step. And I'm very, very happy to introduce today, add him to the stage, Mr. Jochen Grotenhöfer of Transition Consult, published consultant in the book Creating Constructive Cultures. And I have had the pleasure, Jochen, of working with you for, goodness, now nearly 14 years. It's just about 14 years and 2 months on developing leaders and cultures and organizations. And so wonderful to have you here today to talk about this topic. So thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, John, and good afternoon into the ether. When John asked me to join this roundtable discussion, I was thinking about what could I present in terms of what is interesting for you to maybe look into. I've been working with human synergistics models for some almost 20 years now. And one of the things that I keep running into is questions of clients, people that I work with, leaders and people in general alike. How does human synergistics and the model of constructive behavior interlink with all the other models that are there around us, like Golden Profiler or MBTI or Insights or any other tools that you might think of? Now, sure, there is an answer to that, and I'm not going to go into that too much, other than the idea, the one thing that sets human synergistics really apart from many other tools that are around on the marketplace is that it is, in the best sense of the word, judgmental. It tells you what to do and what not to do, rather than just fixing the point of this is where you are and stick with it. I'm doing a lot of training as well as leadership development. And what I've been trying to do there is not only get them to understand human synergistics, but try and find different perspectives from different sides, link in with different models that I found helpful and useful to explain what the idea of constructive behavior is all about. I would like to take you through some of these models today, very briefly, to give you an idea where to look if you were trying to spruce up and spice up your presentations or the training models that you were using so far.
Yeah.
One of the first. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to emphasize what an important topic it is. HS models and our circumplex have that academic background, but that always has to be translated in some way before we bring that message into organizations. So bridging that gap between the models and how we communicate this in the business, what we're talking about, where we're going is really, really helpful. So that's, I think, very much what you're talking about, and a great asset for organizations to understand how we best, again, communicate and translate this message to something people can understand and more importantly, act upon.
One of the things that I do when I train constructive behavior is I expose participants, leaders in particular, to a situation that they're not used to. I try and put them under stress. And the context that I use for that is what is called a transaction analysis. Now, this analysis, this model was basically developed more than 50 years ago, 60 years ago, by Eric Byrne, a Canadian, who basically came up with the idea of ego statuses. What he meant by that was that we all have different backgrounds that we take with us from a child to a parent and adult stage, basically describing preferred behaviors in situations that we find ourselves in. If you take the next page.
Yes, of course.
We have three egos or states. One is the parent state, which basically will take that because we copy behaviors that we've seen from our parents. And these behaviors could either be consoling or patronizing. They'll tell us what to do, or they are trying to comfort us. On the other side of the spectrum, we have what we call the child state, the behavior that a child would take in a situation that it finds difficult to deal with. And that, again, could be covering two contents. One would be what is called the rebellious child. So he's talking back to me. He is not behaving reasonably. He's screaming around. And the complacent child that does everything that it's been told to do. Now, you might immediately identify some of these behaviors as aggressive or defensive. And that is the first link that we find with between the transaction analysis and the human synergistics model of constructive behavior. Because I can link the model to the transaction analysis. And what I've asked people to do in situations that I put them in is to remain what we call an adult state, which is exactly a description of constructive behavior. Now, fancy an example. I'm asking participants to try and talk to their CEO. It's a matter of life and death. But they need to get past the PDA or secretary, mostly played by me. And I will take them through either a parental behavior or a childish behavior or adult behavior from my side to trigger behavior on their side. The task, obviously, is to keep an adult ego. The minute they fall out of that role by not just saying something, but also rolling their eyes, behaving, moving their body in a particular way, they're out. Thereby we have a very strong example of how very little behaviors can make an impact of being aggressive or defensive. You take the next page.
Yes, indeed.
You might or might not heard of that "I'm okay, you're okay" scenario. That's basically the so-called life positions model that was derived from Burns transaction analysis. And without going into too much detail, it might be obvious to you if you look at the top right corner. If I'm okay and you're okay, that's my position. If I feel safe in where I am, and I believe you are a constructive individual as well, we are on the same terms. We are constructive with each other. If you look at the top left corner, I'm not okay, you are okay, then I'm putting myself down. I'm going to behave very defensively. Bottom right corner, I'm okay, you're not okay. Quite obviously, a very patronizing, possibly aggressive behavior. The one thing that doesn't really fit into the human synergistics model is that I'm not okay, you're not okay, kill yourself. We don't have that within human synergistics, and I'm not advocating to include that.
Well, it's if I can interrupt, I use this. It's funny, I didn't realize you were using this. I use this as well these days in circumplex accreditation. So the "I'm okay, you're okay" balance is great. So if I can help you, I'm okay, you're exactly right. That's the, I'm not primarily perceiving either myself nor others as essentially a risk, but I'm viewing myself and others as essentially an opportunity. You're right. We've looked into this. So when I'm not okay, but you are, that's typically associated with, like, as you pointed, passive defensive thinking, right? I'm not sure what to do. I'm not up to the challenge. I think I might make a mistake. So we begin sort of dealing with that insecurity by reaching out to others to see, well, what would you do? What should I do, right? And that the "I'm okay, but you're not okay" is, you're right, very much associated with aggressive perception. I perceive risk, but it's in other people. And that therefore encourages us in many cases to use those sort of controlling, aggressive defensive patterns to try to reduce that perceived risk. Actually, "I'm not okay and you're not okay" does exist. That really is when we get patterns of both strong aggressive and strong passive styles. And you'll see this in cultures as well as, of course, teams and across levels. But that's and that is correlated with the most negative sorts of outcomes where, I'm not sure that I'm up to the task, so I'm withholding and procrastinating and deferring to others. At the same time, I don't necessarily perceive others as being safe either, and that makes it difficult for me to reach out, collaborate, and so on. So you do find workplaces that contain both of those, and unfortunately, that definitely does have a consequence. That perception of such a risky, insecure environment. It's a good parallel. Thank you.
You take the next page, please.
Yes, sir.
I gave you that example so we can flip that one. That material, I guess, will be available for other people to download later on, I guess. So.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Yeah, we'll be making these presentations available. So thank you very much.
Yeah, we don't need that exercise. I talked about that. Take the next page. Relatively recently, I came across the concept of internal saboteurs by Shirzad Shamin, who is a Stanford professor, or at least lectures there, is the CEO of a very large training organization, a coaching organization. And he's come up with the idea of what are the behaviors and how can I describe them that actually hold us back from being constructive. You can actually take a test. It's quite interesting. It's not nearly as substantial as the human synergistics 180 questions on individual performance and behavior preferences. But it provides you with a high-level idea of who are your saboteurs and who take the biggest influence on you when you are faced with adversity, stress, or any situation that sort of makes you feel uncomfortable. Take the next page. I'll give an example. This is one of the outcomes of a test that we all can take on the page www.positiveintelligence.com. And this individual here comes out as a very strong controller, as a stickler, somebody who is very interested in pedantically sort of getting everything right, perfectionist, we would call him. Victim, somebody who takes the blame for everything and believes everything is going to go wrong. Somebody who's very restless and trying to assure that nothing goes wrong. Hyperachiever, people that do too much without really getting anywhere. I'm not going to go through that in all detail because that's going to crush my timeline, but you'll find in that presentation, or maybe we'll go to the next page, some of the explanations of who is that. And as a controller, for example, anxiety-based need to take charge. We need to control situations, and we're very, very upset if that's not possible. We get highly impatient and anxious, highly stressed individual. Now, can we link that to any of the human synergistics behavioral styles? And I guess we can. There is power. There is perfectionism. I haven't spent a whole lot of time going through each and every behavior pattern, but I believe there are very strong links between those two. And again, I'm using this as a different approach to, okay, this is the model. What does power and perfectionism actually mean? How does that crystallize in an individual? What kind of picture can I draw for you in order to describe what that individual does and needs? And it's actually, I find it, taking it from the feedback of the people that I worked with, as a very a very good working example, because it's very pictorial. People can relate to a controller and the description more than they can relate to somebody who is a perfectionist. This is why I'm using it. Yeah, so I'm trying to use pictures, mental images, for people to understand what that individual is all about. If they themselves are about to be a controller, or if we take the next page, for example, the avoider. I guess we all know that individual. We only look at the good things. We wouldn't deal with the problematic, stressful, the unpleasant tasks and conflicts and people in particular. And again, we can relate that to human synergistics behavioral styles like avoidance on the one side, but also approval. Yeah, telling everybody how wonderful that individual is and what you would like to do for them just to avoid the stress. I'm not going to take you through, but you can flip through the others very briefly because I've entered them. Victim, obviously, can be blamed. Somebody, obviously, approval style, pleasing everybody. Hyper rational, very focused on rational processing of everything, including relationships. The stickler, the perfectionist, very conventional on the other side as well. So we have a combination of defensive and aggressive behaviors here. And that is not a rare thing to see. Restless, people who can't sort of sit down and be happy with what they have, always looking for something new and exciting and different. Yeah, hyperachiever, hyper vigilant. Yeah, okay. That's Charmaine's positive intelligence. The third and last model that I'm using is Virginia Sellars' communication types. Virginia is a family, or was, she's actually died some 20 years ago, an American family psychiatrist who was doing a lot of research in terms of communication within the family. And she came up with 4, well, to be fair, it's 5 types of behaviors. And again, I was using these behaviors, these behavioral types, to illustrate constructive behavior in relation to individuals and giving them a role model. We have, can you go back to the blamer very briefly? Obviously, somebody who finds fault in everything, very aggressive, very high energy. He is, however, a very lonely individual. Strikes me as somebody who could be related to somebody who is very power oriented. Somebody who's trying to control everything, but doesn't have friends, doesn't have very good relations. Lo and behold, that does also links to a low extension in humanistic and affiliative behavior on the other side. That's one. The other one, we talked about that in different ways already, the placator. Yeah, we have that individual who wants to please, he never disagrees, he seeks approval, and quite obviously, that's approval style number 3 in the human synergistics behavioral style clock. The computer, the very rational guy who doesn't show emotions, but still might have them. So it's not only this is what he shows to the public, but there is something happening in between that inside that can't be seen, which needs to be found out if you're coaching these people. Where is the button that you need to press to get that individual to get enthused, interested, communication wise, more interested than he is already. The 4th and last style is the distractor. That guy or girl is everywhere. He can be a blamer, he can be a placator, he can be a distractor. You cannot pinpoint her to one particular issue. You might come up with a problem and she's not going to follow you up on that, but rather find ways of distracting from the subject for all sorts of reasons. The 5th type that we have here is the constructive behavior, the leveler, the one that has an emotional balance, that one who can relate to people, a very clear description of what we term as constructive behavior. I'm using all these 3 models and some more at different stages in my professional career, for training purposes, for coaching purposes, to basically use them as pictures, illustrate them, use them as bridges to explain what the behavior, what is meant by human synergistics behavior types, and how does that translate to people that we all know. And that's one of the nice things of these models. You get a connection with your client immediately, not necessarily about the model, but about the types and the descriptors that we found within these 3 adjacent models.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Like I said, this is something we always need to connect, our concepts in HS to the clients, and doing it in this way is, as you described, these are very, very helpful methods. I could go on and on about this. I'm happy to. So let's bring our other speakers on, and we'll discuss Jochen's perspectives and input. I'm sure others also have had some experiences sharing these kinds of insights and making these kinds of connections for clients. So thank you for joining me today, Ali and Christian. Very nice to have you. Looking forward to your presentations. Interested in your feedback on Jochen's content and yeah, your perspectives.
I mean, why don't I dive in? I mean, Jochen, it's interesting to me that some of the frameworks you were using are coming from a slightly more personal family therapy sort of academic perspective. I guess that is often, maybe risky is too strong a word, but the nice thing about the human synergistics framing is you can put it across, at least at the start, in a relatively neutral way. Whereas the tools that you're talking about start to delve a little bit faster and more deep into childhood issues and issues that to some extent may fall slightly outside of the remit of a sort of formal business coach. With the folk that you're talking to, when do you begin to introduce them, or have you not found that to be much of a concern?
To answer the last question, that's exactly the case. I have not found that to be much of a concern, because then using these models, you need to think about that. But I think I've used them exclusively in a team setting, not in an individual setting. So it turns out to be a high-level exercise and a high-energy exercise across the group. We're not going into a deep dive of your personal behavior, your inner anxiousness and childhood problems. I'm just giving people a context in which to behave and understand why they're behaving in that way. So, for example, in the transaction analysis I have had, for example, this is not meant to be a stereotype, but I've had several women who were approaching me in a quite a different way than men, trying to get through. And there was bribing involved, there was flirting involved, and there was no aggressive behavior involved. And people see that. I have the rest of the group watching. And that is an impact learning, experiential learning that they have as a group. It never turned out to be a finger pointing exercise in terms of, oh yeah, now we know how your parent was.
Yeah,
that never happened.
Interesting.
Yeah, from my side, I mean, we're all about a picture's worth 1,000 words. So, those concepts of translating behavioral patterns and styles into, player learner versus victim knower kinds of terminologies really helps to make these things a bit more tangible to participants. So that in terms of translating the concepts into something that we can communicate and understand and so on, is one benefit. Another one really can be, there are really strengths to using instruments like LSI in human synergistics, looking at psychological and behavioral patterns of individuals together with, and I've had consultants do this actually together with personality assessments. So those are two different things that we're really measuring. But it can be helpful to start to dig into, why do I approach my work the way that I do? Why do I interact with my team the way that I do? Where is that coming from? What's the motivation? And what am I bringing in to that? So that you can find those connections between, things like personality and preferences and behavioral patterns. But at the end of the day, what I like to emphasize is the fact that, those preferences and personality characteristics are interesting and very good to know about ourselves, but sort of by definition, they're not developmental. We're not going to change our personality moving forward, but thankfully what we can do with some good understanding is to change maybe how we react and respond as a result. So it's sort of very helpful to understand kind of, where my motivations are, where my preferences are, and how that's influencing how I respond so that I can use that for development.
So much.
And I find that to be sorry.
Good. So Jochen, thank you so much for showing, maybe what does it mean being an approval? How does someone behave being there? So giving examples, I believe that building this common ground and vocabulary before going into any kind of discussion is I think utmost important to start with educating people that, if you say competitiveness, what does that really mean in the circumplex, right? So I had a lot of sessions where people said, so what's so wrong in being competitive, right? So understand what is, the difference being competitive, on cost of others, or is it, in benefit of the team, which is then maybe more achievement driven than competing against someone else on cost of someone else. So I think building this common ground in vocabulary, especially introducing this into teams, groups, organizations, I think this is where it starts. And I believe it's a great, first inspiration about, okay, what does that mean? Are we all talking about the same when we say approval behavior, that we all understand just the same, and then keep going the conversation?
Yes, that is very important. I'm taking a bit of time in the beginning of training sessions of that kind to run them through what it means, actually, very much like you say. And some of the terms that human synergistics uses in description of their styles are can be interpreted, let's call it that way, and are interpreted by clients in not quite the right way, perfectionism, for example, but also, as you said, competitiveness. They start querying, is there a good thing in there? Or oppositional behavior, a very strong one. People say, well, we need to find a few mistakes. We need to point out if something goes wrong. And we have a discussion in terms of to what extent does that serve the purpose of becoming better, more efficient and constructive. And the minute they realize I can take it over the top and not serve the group, the team, the organization, my own development, but my saboteurs, if you will, we're starting to have a problem. So I completely agree with you in that one.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other input or questions? Any questions from the audience? See if anything's coming in. If anyone has questions or points for Jochen, please feel free to type those in. Thank you so much, Jochen. A very, very important part of, I think, every development journey is getting a broader context than just HS models so that we can understand, connect with, and best act on these learnings. Love it. Thank you. So I'll bring up our schedule here. I think we're hopefully sticking fairly close to our time. Then I believe we can transition over. Thank you so much, Jochen. Transition over to Mr. Ali. Thank you so much, Ali, for joining us today. Let me remove our timeline here. So really happy to have you. Thank you so much. I know your schedule was quite full, so I'm glad we could fit you in, and you could too. So Ali is the kind of human being who inspires those around him to take on a caring and positive nature, always bringing the good vibes. Ali loves to connect with people and build strong communities. His mission is to make lasting impact and change on the lives of others for the better. Very much the kind of motivation and purpose we're all about. So very happy to have you here today, Ali. It's been wonderful working with you. So thanks for coming to share the learnings.
Sure.
Thank you. I have to confess just before you take over that I had a little issue with the slide that you sent. I couldn't get that to upload properly. So thankfully, I see you have a background that's appropriate. So while you're discussing, I might just I might take myself off of the stage so that people can best see that clearly. Is that sound good?
That sounds good, and I think it's not much. I think it's colorful, but it's not much words on it. But we will deep dive a bit into that later on. So I think that's okay. We can just go, I believe.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
Cool.
Looking forward to it.
So what I would like to share today is like how starting a movement with multipliers. If we go into those kind of diagnoses and culture changes, there's most likely a small group, and looking to the future, it's helpful having some other people together with you creating a kind of impact. So probably you need more than just 1 or 3 people who want to impact, most likely maybe 100 of people or 1,000 of people going forward in this change. And I want to start today with a quote. And the quote is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." I repeat, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has been. Give me some time for reflection. I like those pauses in between, where we can start a bit, reflect and think what we have said. So I think filling this code is very easy. So we're very small groups that are loosely connected, united by a shared purpose, creating a kind of transformational change. Like, I mean, when we look back, the civil rights in the US, the Indian independence, the color revolution in Eastern Europe, I think there's much more. And, you know, I always believed in that movements don't have to be big to create an impact. Sometimes it's not more than just starting, building curiosity, and sharing a desire, a hope, a dream that you embody, where then others join your cause. So one option of starting a movement, and I will come to the multiplication part later on, is about building curiosity. May it was a desire, a hope, a dream you have. And may you know that there is a couple of good YouTube videos about how to start a movement. Most likely you are, you know, there's a lonely knot dancing long time alone on the dance floor. And then at one point of time, there's a first follower who's joining that, let's call it lonely knot, who's want to start this movement. Actually, the first follower is actually much more important than lonely knot, because this is then actually a person starting the movement where then other followers are following the first follower. So now combining this movement with individuals and sustaining this in a community who helps each other to grow, I think that's some of the secret of continuation. Now, I think we all get that intellectually, how to start that and what to think, and we all have seen this and, you know, experienced this and so on. I think the question is now how we practically do it. And by the way, on LinkedIn, under my name, Ali Cengiz, you can see a series of 10 secrets, what is needed to build and sustain a high-performing community. So check this out. And today I want to share one of them. And, you know, we are so used to in business or in meetings, from steering committees, from leadership teams who ask for a kind of project plan or a project plan with milestones or conceptual PowerPoint slides. And I've stopped doing that since, I believe now 3 years or so. Most likely people are getting a drawn picture, as you can see in my backhand, and a story. And today I would like to share one of them connected to infuse hopes and dreams by reading out of a diary entry of a participant joining a community. And actually it's like physical, it's really like a diary entry. So I have a lot of stories here I have read to my organization I'm working in. And one of them I would like to display as dreams and hopes. And it goes like this. Dear diary, so what? I know, it's weird starting like this. And believe me, it felt weird to me too. Since last month, I have been joining this community, an environment that feels different. Coming here is like stepping into a zone where I can be my authentic self. No judgment, no one I must prove myself to. Just a feeling of belonging, being valued and respected. Now, let me come back to this, so what? In the last gathering, they used a technique to become more self-aware, discovering what in my life takes energy and where I lose myself in time. They called it love activities. I thought they would tell me on how to figure this out. However, they did not. Instead, they asked questions in smaller groups based on an educational podcast we had listened to beforehand. They encouraged us to discover, spark discussions, promoted learning, and created room for reflection based on some science-based techniques. The moderator later asked me, so what? So what are you doing now with this reflection? Gosh, my reflection was that I forgot to think. So far, everyone told me what to do. While sharing my observations, people were listening. They were listening to understand, not listening to answer. They were asking questions, good questions. I want to ask questions like this too. I want to listen actively like this too. My so what is that I want to be part of this crew and evolve together. So diary, I'm asking you now, what is your so what? So that was a diary entry of a participant may joining this community. And I think it's important that, you know, we ask a couple of questions while doing that. So what are the hopes and feelings a community member should have being part of that? What do you give them as a community builder without any expectation in the beginning to get something back? How can you let them grow that they are that inspired to multiply back? How patient are you till the first is multiplying actually, without you have to tell them to multiply? And you do this, you dance alone, long time. And at one time, one of them will be your first follower. Till someone is coming and saying, thank you. This journey changed my life. My loved ones are saying I'm different, and this different feels good to them and to me. Here we are, open for dialogue.
Very inspiring, Ali. Thank you so much. You've done such incredible work creating and activating your network with Inspire, and this is something that is always a topic in developing organizations, especially when we talk about culture, developing a culture change champion network, or however we have to multiply this message and really get everybody on board. Goes far beyond just the OD and leadership team. So thank you so much. Before I contribute too much to this, as I have a bad habit of doing, let me bring the rest of the experts on board here and hear from them. Thank you so much.
I mean, Ali, my question, firstly, thank you for sharing.
Any observations or reflections? Yeah. So Jochen, Christian, what is your so what?
Oh, I mean, the observation that I had, I mean, firstly, the observation from your diarist about learning to think, for me was profound. I mean, I was in a corporate role for nearly 25 years, and that was the one thing that was absolutely shocking, having come out of that position, is it's amazing how constraining having to balance lots of competing interests and make sure you never say anything that offends anybody. The sort of unconscious constraints that you operate in naturally in an organization, I think, is quite profound. So the fact that you're able to create that space, people don't necessarily have to leave the organization. They can be their authentic selves, but also learn to think again. I think creating that safe space is extraordinary. I mean, the one thing about being the lone nut dancing is it takes an inordinate amount of courage. And I guess the question for me, you spoke about going from hyper-structured, and I'm terrified to say I'm about to show you some very hyper-structured slides, so you know which side of the pendulum I am on this. But how did you evolve for you yourself? Where did you find the courage to let go of all of that control and just give it back to people, let people leverage their own intelligence, create space for themselves in your own personal journey? When did you see that point of inflection?
I can talk till tomorrow about this, so let me share just some spots, right? You know, of course it's a journey coming to that point, right? Especially if you work in a big corporate like I am working. So having concepts, having detailed planning, having things to show to any kind of leadership team, steering committees, entertaining leadership teams in their meetings. I mean, that's is common practice in the outside world, right? So it's hard to going there and saying, you know what, I do not have a presentation today. And you know what I'm not doing much today. My role is more now coaching you through the next 1.5 hours. So I have prepared a sheet of paper for you. Just read through now. So that's something, you know, of course, didn't came from today to tomorrow. And I have to say that, you know, looking now to human synergistic and the circumplexes, I was very long, I don't know, 6 months in an avoidance state. You know, there was asking for this kind of roadmap, project plan for our culture journey. And I was, you know, and I worked in the consulting, I can do that, right? It's not one of the things I cannot do to put a project plan together and run through that, but it felt just wrong. And through that wrongness, I said, what is that, you know, what is holding me back doing it? Because normally it's maybe like a half-day thing. And I was thinking and reflecting for myself, what is the right thing to do? When we talk about self-awareness, is that something we can put in a project plan? Is that something we can check mark tomorrow and then, yes, suddenly you're self-aware? No, probably it's a year-long journey, right? So I took like 6 months. I had like for those kind of topics with the self-awareness, I had like different stories. And we were luckily involved in the leadership team meetings, about a day doing those kind of people and culture sessions. And I was reading out through my diary, through the pain I'm feeling, through the pain in my stomach, in my heart, what I think in my head, openly sharing this, which helped me, writing those stories, reading this out, that I said at one point of time, you know what, you're not getting a project plan. You're getting a picture in the story and we're starting there. This is how it's evolving. And maybe we have a roadmap, but it's not where you check mark a milestone, now you are the best leader. No, we're doing it differently this time. And that evolved somehow. I don't know. This is what I can share.
Thank you.
Love it.
Ali, it struck me when you... Sorry.
Please.
It struck me when you talked about that, the individual on the dance floor, and I can very much relate to that. What I found helpful was what I would call alliances. I mean, you're not alone in this. If you want to move people forward, there's two ways: being perfectly proud and happy with yourself and very audacious, and come up with, as you said, this is my way forward, and it's taken me 6 months of mourning to come to that, but okay, I'll do it now. I'd like to delve into the other part of it. How did you cater for your alliances? How did you cater for the people who would help you make that move? I mean, what's wrong going to the dance floor with 2 couples rather than just one?
Yeah. Maybe going one step back is connecting Christian and what you have said, Jochen, is increasing self-esteem, probably something what is driving the courage, right? So that you're aware about your values, about your strengths, how what you do is contributing to your values and strengths, and sharing this also authentically and openly with the community who may join the movement, but are not sure yet what they should do, right? So catering about those people, and one of my strengths, empathy and positivity, is providing that space and giving them back. So around educating them around those topics we are talking about, helping them becoming more self-aware, maybe going through the same journey with having strengths-based coaching with them. So these are the things, we catered and offered to those people, where we saw some of them maybe will take this up one time and multiply without we have to tell them, multiplying the techniques. And then after some time, this really happened. But it's like you have to be a giver first. The catering is care. You have to just care about the people, and you have to care, not because you must care, because this is the job title or your profile. You have to care because you want to care about the people, because the people are important to you. And people will recognize if you're authentic about this or not. So that was, I think, one of the secret sauce, what, we embody to those people.
Lovely, thank you.
Sure. You're on mute, John.
Thank you. Trying not to be disruptive. What I like about what you focus on is, those are the pieces of the network development that and creating those change that is often overlooked. So a lot of times organizations recognize we need that kind of network to pull the organization forward, to create this change more sustainably and so on. But they're thinking about it in, if I can say so, somewhat of a task-oriented way, right? So it's sort of, how do we identify those individuals? What is their responsibility? What are we going to expect them to do? And that's all important. But what you're describing is really what makes this real, what makes it sustainable, what gives it life, and gives people the kind of the sense of engagement and participation that builds that desire, not just to take steps forward, but to bring people along with them. So a lot of times I'm advising clients on sort of that structural piece, and we do have ways of, identifying individuals in organizations that can help in terms of driving change in organizations' culture. We look at people in terms of, things like essentially social networks, who's in touch with the most of your employees, who's communicating most frequently, who do people reach out to when they have questions or they have problems. That may be their formal leader or manager, but you might be surprised how often there's, those informal networks playing out and people reaching out to others you might not expect. And those people then are very helpful to, if we can find them, if we can get them on board, give them the concept of what we're talking about, to translate that message. And it's not just about getting more people on board, it's about getting the message through the organization, because those change champions also allow you to sort of translate the overarching message for the development to kind of what are our takeaways for this department, this part of the business, right? So, I mean, it's, for example, it's helpful to understand that we want to be curious and adaptive and so on. But how we do that in different functions and different areas of business is important to sort of translate. How do we do that here? And again, that informal network of how do we support one another and create that change. And what I loved about what you said, and I'll stop my input there, but is that diary that you read is really what I think we're all about. What you're hearing there is, not that the client did a diagnostic, not that the client organization, identified those factors they need to change. They created real positive change in the organization, and you're hearing that in the fundamental aspects of your employees' well-being that you want. And it's that kind of change in organizations that drives your engagement and motivation and all of those things. One of my favorite feedbacks I got from one organization was, we had been working on a culture development, and one of the leaders had left because she was going on maternity leave and came back to the organization, I think about 9 months later, maybe a year later. And the feedback was, I can't believe that this is the same organization. It's really so different in terms of how we, work together, approach tasks, and it's such a positive and inspiring shift. And really, that's what we're all about, both Human Synergistics and I know all of us here. But it takes a journey to get there, and it takes much more than just a good plan and good data to create that kind of effect. So.
That's funny. That's funny that you're saying this, though. We had a similar situation with someone, went out and come back into the organization, and then, the person said, something changed here. What is it? I want to know, because I want to feel the same, because it's different. What is it? So, that curiosity and saying something feels better than before. What is it? I really want to know. I think this is, what you're talking about. And if this is happening, I mean, this is magic.
Yeah, this is the kind of qualitative feedback we like to hear. And that, to me, shows that we're shifting the culture, right? There are kinds of ways we can look at that quantitatively, but it's so cool to hear people come back and say, well, something's changed. It's not the furniture, it's not the leaders, it's not, something's very different here. And I can feel it, and it's an energy, and it's exciting. And that's culture development. And it's wonderful to see that happening. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Other insights. This is a very common question and topic for, especially, the larger organizational development, right? When we're using these tools to coach and develop individual leaders or teams, we can really work directly with our target audience. But when we're trying to shift the patterns and culture of, thousands of people, then we have to be able to disseminate that message. That goes back to a lot of what Jochen was talking about. How do we give people, pictures and models and examples that resonate, so we kind of get a feeling for, right, what we're talking about, and also then how do we leverage our internal community to help one another along this journey. And one other point I would make, if you're familiar with Human Synergistics instruments at the organizational level, when we look at climate factors in organizations that influence culture, of course, leadership tends to be the most influential of that, but a very close second in many organizations is something called employee involvement, meaning the extent to which the organization, reaches out proactively, involves people in decisions that affect them, and so on. And creating that network of internal champions and support is a beautiful both method for communicating this message, but also lever for encouraging participation and shifting culture, because by reaching out to those people, you're really sending the message that we value you, we want your support, we want your participation. And again, I think it's a important message that a leadership team can't change the culture alone. We have to go through this as a partnership with our people. And I think that's a very healthy and positive way to think about that kind of change.
Great.
Fantastic. Thank you. Any other questions or comments about creating internal change champions and networks, multipliers? By the way, one of our most frequently requested and referenced books is Multipliers. Very, very good book if you're familiar with it. And again, a book that really connects very directly with HS concepts. It's not, doesn't reference our models directly, but that is a wonderful book for understanding what we're talking about with constructive behavior, and how constructive behavior not only helps individuals to perform well, but it helps us to work effectively across with others, so that multiplying effect, bringing out greatness in myself as well as growing that high performance in others. And that was one other point you made, the concept around developing high performance. I think that is a very healthy way to think about what human synergistics is all about. Sometimes when people are initially introduced to our models, they fall into that perspective of thinking about behavior as good or bad or right or wrong, but being able to view these things from a different perspective and recognize that it's not that we're doing something wrong, it's just we need to understand what we're currently doing, how that's affecting us, and therefore with that understanding moving forward, what could we do differently that would lead us toward the kinds of performance we would like, that growing high performance and value. So again, it's not about fixing a problem, it's about developing performance across people, teams, and organizations.
Yeah. Maybe one more thing I want to share with those multiplier communities is that I believe that, right at the beginning in the journey communicating, we are now building a community. I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think those communities have to be built up naturally. And most things we say is that in town hall meetings or presentations, we most likely overpromise and do not deliver. So, it's done again, this blah, blah, and then people are not feeling it. So I think that the better, the more smartest way is that you start with that, and then some of them are multiplying in their teams, and their smaller teams, and people feel this first, that something is changing, and then you are able to communicate that there is something, right? So first deliver, and then start promising, and not the other way around. And then you're building this naturally, and it will take some time, right? It's not now, it's fundamentally wrong. Well, what we do in most cases, top-down nomination of champions or multipliers. That's the worst thing you can do. So people have to raise their hand. People have to get by themselves proactive. And then you will see they will pop. It's like a popcorn. So they will pop up. So in those 200 or 150 who raise their hand, I want to do something. I don't know, maybe 10% are really doing something. But you will recognize you are connected to those people. You will recognize those people. And then you have to take those people and start giving them self-awareness, values. They have a same executive coach as the leadership team. They get the same offsites as the leadership team. So equal eye-to-eye level conversations and treatment. And then after some time, they will just do by themselves, even you're not telling them.
And I've always been amazed by, how much change we can create, even with a fairly small community of multipliers. Because a lot of times we think, as you said, if we're going to dictate this top down and tell people, right, then, you're going to somehow need to convince almost the majority of people before you can really that's not the way to do it. What you want to do is create a pull in the organization where you're not telling people how to behave, but you're creating that opportunity to approach their work in the ways that are consistent with our values. And right? So it's amazing how you can start with a very small group and create a tremendous pull. So honestly, the majority of culture development projects that we do across organizations start with very small teams, even units and departments. We get in because we have a team or a leadership team or whatever that's having some challenges working together, or recognize that they could be more high performing. We then have a look at what's going on, get some good diagnostics, give them some focus in terms of where they need to, and we are able to create that change with that group, demonstrate that this is working, and that's the snowball that you work with to begin building that larger systemic change. And what happens in the business is people see that 20 people or 40 people or whatever that part of the business you're working with, and they see change happening there. And it's not about those 20 people changing everyone else. It's about those 20 people approaching their work in ways that are most effective, and others noticing this. And hey, they're able to do more creative things. Look what's going on in that team. Why aren't we doing that? And you're creating this pull in the organization where people are really recognizing there's something cool going on here. And that's the kind of enthusiasm and interest you want to try to generate within the organization, rather than trying to sort of create that interest by telling people what to do, if that makes sense. And it could be a very small amount of people, but that can be the kernel that creates the change.
One of the little downsides of doing it is the time that we have available. In many of the projects that I've been running, the steam was running out because even though we had a small kernel, people were restless to see change to happen much quicker, particularly on the higher level end of the organization. I mean, I usually say this is not a diet, this is a change of nourishment. Even though I say it, they don't believe it. And after 6 months latest, we get the first signs of, oh, this is going to take really long. There's other projects coming around the corner. This is really important. We need to reprioritize. Is this still an important thing? I'm all for having a kernel and having a small team developing their changes and infecting the rest of the organization. At some stage, I think we need to have a supporting concept of this is still a number one priority.
Right.
Something like making it a standard agenda point on the board of directors meeting, which I've found to be very effective, even though it was tiresome to the people involved at the time. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. When do we have that? When do we need some organizational support to turn this self-developing little virus that we hope for into a disease that actually sort of gets all of the company?
I agree. And I can share one example about the journey we were in. I think it's so important, Jochen, what you have said. Like that should be a fundamental agenda topic every quarter offsite a leadership team has to drive their topics, right? So in our case, like we had like three-day leadership team meetings, and one day was always dedicated to all culture topics we're doing. And that was always set. It's always the first day, no discussion, no negotiation. And at the same time, we had a group of people who are driving this, right? So in the back end architecting stuff. And one of them, actually super important that this person is on the table. It's not there's a sponsor or whatever and then communicating back and forth to this team. It's about equality, having eye-to-eye conversations on the table about this topic. And if you want to have to really function that's the way how to do it. And they will always tell, we don't have time, especially for multiplier communities. We don't have like 6 months, 9 months to identify the right people to do it. So good, we talk in 9 months again, and then we see where you are. And how often I had the case, like after 6 months, they came back, it didn't work out. Why the community died? So we can talk.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with as well, Jochen. It has to be a priority. And one of the things I like to think about with culture is, and tell leadership teams, is we're really not, in a way, we're not adding more things to your agenda. What we're asking for you to do is talk about what is existing on your agenda and connect that in through the framework of culture. So, the two things I'm usually trying to connect to culture profiles for clients are KPIs. So not just understanding our culture, but how that's affecting our people's engagement, customer orientation, motivation, so on and so forth, as well as our values. What of these behaviors represents living our values and what's inconsistent with our values? And most of the leadership teams I'm in touch with are talking about KPIs and values and mission regularly. Now we're just asking you to kind of connect that and have that framework to understand how we're talking about that with reference to culture. One of my favorite quotes from a client, and this was from the CEO at a global presentation to the people, was that they really had 3 priorities as an organization moving forward for the next 5 years. The first priority was living their values. The second priority was improving performance, improving safety, and speed to market, and so on. So performance. And the third priority was culture development. And of those 3 things, the leader stood up and said, culture development is the first priority, because if we can't shift the way we work, we're not going to get the performance we want, and we're not going to move toward living the values. This has to be the #1 framework. So really, if we could just put culture at the top of the list, and then continue with our agenda around what are those KPIs and engagement, and how frequently are employees turning over, and how are we serving customers, then we have a framework to understand why what we're seeing and what we can do about it. And that's a more not only tangible but actionable way for leaders to discuss those topics. So it's not about doing more; it's about doing it with a better reference and a framework and then it becomes tangible. Once we understand what kind of culture we need moving forward to perform at our best, then we can start talking about how do I do that as a leader personally, so that people see this, recognize it, role model it. How do I encourage that with my team? How do we communicate that through our internal network? And suddenly you have a language around which you can actually lead and guide your culture forward, rather than allowing yourselves as a leadership team to be led forward by the existing, by the culture itself. We can either lead culture or be led by it. That's the ultimate decision that leaders and everyone in organizations have. So it's nice to have that model and understanding, so that we can be proactive in guiding and creating what we want, rather than sort of passively being pulled and influenced. Very good. Very good. Any other questions? Questions from audience members? Questions from anyone, any of the panel? All right. Thank you very much, Ali. Lovely, lovely content. And I'm sure everyone got a lot out of it, and appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Very good. So let me bring up our agenda one more time, just to make sure we keep ourselves on plan. We'll be switching gears here. Thank you so much for the input. And I would love to welcome Mr. Christian Sellars to the discussion. Thank you so much, Christian, for taking the time to contribute today. It's been really fantastic working with you on your projects, and you participated as well as Jochen in the last roundtable. I know got so much good feedback on your concepts. Happy to have you again. So thanks so much for participating and sharing.
Sure. Thank you, John. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here and to be in such esteemed company. I think the presentation that I'm going to share is a bit of a case example. So we're going to go from sort of like very, very deep to very, very practical. The specific question that I have, and it's very much related to what we were discussing just now about multipliers and how do you sustain change? How do you make that organic? How do you initiate that sort of chain reaction? I'm trying to see that in the context of a sort of an organizational planning cycle or an organization activity cycle. How can we take a very specific case and then move it where culture becomes incorporated into the standard rituals and practices that an organization takes forward. So if you want to pull the slides up, I can frame it for the audience a bit. And yeah, very interested in your, Jochen and Ali's insights into how we can make this as effective a change as possible. I'm not naming any names here. East Africa Development is a bit of a pseudonym, but the basic context of this case is this would be a new client. I have done some work for them already, but the idea would be for us to go through a cultural change process over the course of next year. This organization does really amazing work. It is extraordinary. It's a very high performer. It basically competes for and receives grants and then provides those grants for development. So it's very much at the cusp of helping transform communities, bring people out of poverty. So it's got a great reputation, a very, very strong company. It has about 30 people, a really dynamic leader. But recently they completed a survey. They have a new HR director who is very science-based, did this really good review of staff. And the two issues were lumpy allocation of work and communication failings. And the lumpy allocation of work is there's this dynamic group of 5 senior executives who work 24/7, basically do everything, dot all the I's, cross all the T's, make sure all the grant applications are perfect, do a lot of the heavy lifting in the organization, and not a lot of trust from these very senior executives into their teams. And the feedback from the team, surprise, surprise, is we feel underutilized. Our skills are not being exercised. We're standing on the sidelines a lot while our leaders are picking the ball up and running, and we don't feel particularly, valued. And likewise, at the flip side, the senior leaders saying, well, I'd love to trust them, but they're not really at the level yet where I can. So the question is, how do you bite the bullet? How do you push that sort of change through the organization? And the other point is generally communication failings. I think the senior leaders know what needs to be done. They're doing very well in the external environment, but not necessarily transferring that information to inspire and align the people around them. So in that context, let's assume we've done a whole series of diagnostics. This is a bit of a composite to maintain confidentiality, but those of you familiar with the HS tools will see some very interesting patterns here. I think the first thing, if we look on the left-hand side, everyone has a good positive picture of what the ideal is, both at leadership level and across the organization. There are a couple of little spikes of defensive behavior, but in general, people know the kind of leadership that they want and the kind of culture they want, and it's constructive, it's great. So that's all good. But if we look at the strategies that this is informing from our leadership team, we're seeing passive mentoring, negative feedback, unilateral influencing. You've got leaders here that aren't really getting involved and aren't really investing heavily in development. And so, or are giving feedback that ultimately isn't giving people confidence and empowering them to do more difficult work, which is really what they need. If you then look at the actual impact of senior leaders, you see very high opposition, lots of fault finding, and also low humanistic and encouraging. So no great shock there. And when you flip it into the organization, this aggression on the leadership time side naturally then creates passive behavior in the team side, where you're seeing high dependence and high avoidance, people not willing to run without getting the leaders say so. If senior leaders ever travel, everything grinds to a halt. Everything has to wait for 2 weeks before they come back. And so clearly this is not an organization that is going to grow or thrive. The causal factors at a culture level as well, the weak points where things are below average is the involvement and empowerment of employees at a structure level. Communication, downward communication and learning aren't particularly good. And for leadership, it's consideration, taking the time and effort to really understand people and to help their growth. So clearly there are some lacks here that need to be developed. Now, the challenge for me is it's a fairly small organization. I still need to get a good understanding of their rituals and processes, but I have surmised what that might look like on the next slide and tried to drop my work into it. So next slide is a swim lane diagram. And Ali, this is the kind of structural stuff that you grew out of, but I'm still in the starting blocks. My hope is I can filter some slightly more kind of organic multipliers into this, because again, if this is just seen as more work, it's going to exhaust people. But let me quickly run through my thinking, and then we can talk a bit about how do you catalyze really good change in a structure like this. Starting from the top and going down, the key thing for me from the leader perspective is just bringing some awareness for the leader and the team. And I suspect we will see similar behaviors throughout here. So the oppositional behavior, I expect, is entrenched from the CEO down. So just building awareness, coaching people into that. And then, John, I think you mentioned, on board agendas, putting in a culture item in every single quarter. What I've seen highly effective in my previous work has been quarterly scorecards, which are tracking kind of hard KPIs, but also you have from to metrics reflected there. So if you're looking for this team, the obvious move would be from oppositional behavior to humanistic encouraging. If that's something we want to track and talk about every quarter, we put it into the scorecards. They generally use annual performance contracts here. They don't have regular conversations about performance. Annual scorecarding or annual performance contracts aren't particularly effective. We know that needs to be more frequent. So if you can get quarterly conversations at team level, introducing human synergistics changes into the language of that, I think would be really helpful. So I think that's one. The second one then is with the HR department. So dropping down a couple of levels now into review of processes and structures. You can see on the left in the middle there, looking at some of the communication systems, looking at how often they're scheduling town halls. Are they doing briefings? Is there a regular cadence of communication with all the international travel the CEO is doing, with all the briefings they're doing with senior decision makers in government and industry? Is that energy that they're experiencing being shared and communicated and fed into the organization? So looking at processes and structures. And then also providing some quite specific training for the teams. Delegation, I think, is one that really needs to be worked on, as is communication and development plans. So if we can give a good third of the organization framework skills, toolkits to do this work well, you can then set an expectation and then reinforce that through things like town halls over the course of the year. Halfway through the year, we probably can do a bit of a pulse just on the specific issues that came up before we initiated the project. Work allocation, communication isn't improving. And then towards the end of the project, you'd want to do a retest both on LI and on OCI. Now, my challenge as a consultant with this is I can come to them with this and I can try and force in agenda points and force in work. But my worry is I'm just going to be overloading them with more. And you have to do this, and you have to do this. And this stuff is not critical. You don't get any money from doing my work. You don't win any grants. You don't pull any people out of poverty. So Christian sort of kind of chirping in the background and annoying everybody about follow-up, which is generally what I will be doing here, I don't think is going to be the best way of energizing folk. I've done some workshops with this team already. They're very smart. They're very excited that attention is being paid to this stuff. My worry is if it's not done with finesse, and if it's not done in an empowering way, people will get bored of it very quickly. And I think they're already bored of my request for them to complete, LI and culture surveys already. So how do I not be sort of like the sort of follow-up disciplinarian, and how rather do I spark some of those multipliers and spontaneous expressions of organizational change that we spoke about before? That's what I'm interested in learning about.
Oh, fantastic, Christian. Thank you very much. So I just had a few notes, if I can. First of all, it really nicely how it disconnected back to some of the points that Jochen made around transactional relationships. So you were describing this in terms of, leaders versus staff level. Leaders feeling that they're the ones sort of responsible for everything, taking on all the tasks, responsible for decisions, while other parts of the organization may feel underutilized. But in any case, you're getting that sort of transactional relationship of part of the organization is telling, the other part is listening, doing, not questioning, and you get that that transactional pattern. So very, very common factor. The other thing is, and this is an example I actually use in accreditations, is you also talked about the fact that that's encouraged through this hierarchical structure. So and that goes back to topics we talk about in culture and climate. But when we look at distribution of influence in our data, how much authority people have at senior versus mid versus staff levels, and basically how the hierarchy is distributed. You find that the steeper we create that hierarchy, the more you tend to encourage those kinds of transactional relationships across hierarchies. hierarchies. It's sort of an I think it's an interesting thing because that steep hierarchical structure is a good example of a structural factor that then influences how people behave and respond within it. And it's sort of interesting, I think, that, I mean, the broad kind of psychological message that creates, right? If we create our hierarchy, it's very, very steep. What that's sort of suggesting and implying is, firstly, as you said, that leaders are responsible for everything. They have to make sure that, you know, mistakes don't happen. We're responsible for all decisions. And that tends to be associated with some of our, what we would describe as aggressive defensive behavior. Making sure we maintain control. We're the ones ultimately responsible. We don't necessarily trust the capabilities of our staff and team, so we withhold tasks, try to do complete pieces of work. Anyway, so that's encouraging aggressive kinds of norms toward upper hierarchies. It unfortunately sends the opposite messages to staff, which is more along the lines of, you know, your input is not welcome. This is not your job. This is not your responsibility. And that kind of thing really encourages more of those passive patterns where then members are just sort of sitting back, waiting to be told what to do. And you get that aggressive, passive, transactional pattern across hierarchies. All too common for a variety of reasons, but definitely something we do see a lot of. Another point I really like about your timeline, and happy to come to your question, and interested in others' perspectives as well. But I was just talking to a client yesterday about creating their culture journey, and I like what you've got. I mean, that's sort of structurally the two key topics, which from my side is, you know, what are we doing first, second, and third? So literally the timeline of, you know, what do we need to do first 30 days, 60 days, and so on out. That's oftentimes, you know, where clients are paying attention and sort of building that map forward. But the other dimension is the vertical one, meaning what is everyone's role in this? What are leaders doing today, next month, and so on throughout that journey? What are we doing through OD management, change champions, and so on? You know, what is the role of really everyone in this change? Again, if we're talking about real culture development, then we're talking about really everyone being part of this. So the more we can make that clear, the better. I think part of the answer to your question is it's very hard to tell organizations, you know, kind of what to do and what they need, even though, you know, we struggle because with these instruments, you've got a lot of data that will illustrate that. But what we need to try to do is create the pull again. So asking and helping clients to recognize that what they're saying they need, you know, are and building on that in their perspective. This is sort of like ideal descriptions, right? It's very hard to tell organizations that you should have a constructive culture. It's much easier to ask organizations and they'll describe that for you. So I've always find that creating a pull is the not only the best method, but the way we need to try to think about this rather than dictating, because that doesn't stick. And unfortunately, that's usually too consistent with the way we've been doing things before. And one of my other points about culture and culture development is, look, we need to do this differently than we've done anything before. Because if we approach this culture initiative the same way we approached the last 10 projects we tried to do, it's really just reinforcing the existing norms. If we're going to ask people to do something differently, then this needs to feel and smell and differently than what we've done before. And that not only gets people's attention, but sends the message that we are talking about changing the way we do things, not reinforcing and repeating the way we do things.
Yeah, that's really good.
The last piece I would say is I appreciate your statement on the pulse. So for those of you who might not be familiar, you know, our instruments, Human Synergistics, are not only used as diagnostic tools, sort of as the foundation for this development, as well as typically down the line to remeasure and assess progress, but we also have the capability to pulse with these tools. So, you know, we can focus on just very specific aspects of the development, create very short surveys for your people, and it's nice to check in as we move forward. I like to call these sort of the breadcrumbs along the culture or the development journey, because we need that checking in, and it's a wonderful reinforcement for the leadership in the organization to see these things changing. I always say it's a very long time to sort of hold your breath and cross your fingers and drück die Daumen and hope that this development is coming across. You know, we don't really know until we remeasure it 18, 12 months from now, 9 months for individuals. But in any case, that's kind of a long time to hope this is working. I think it's really nice to be able to use that pulse to check in and get some content on, is this resonating? And if not, then we can take corrective steps before to guide us towards success.
Yep. Good. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Christian. Let me pull our experts on stage. Thank you so much. I'm also very happy to welcome as well our final speaker, Sabine Gromer from MagnoliaTree. Thank you so much for joining us, Sabine. I'll pull you on stage as well. So I'd love to hear from the panel of experts on Christian's content. Thank you so much.
Ali, shoot.
Please.
Okay.
Ali, I think you're muted, sir.
Ali, you're muted. Can't hear you. You're on mute.
Hello?
There you are.
No, we got you.
Now it's coming through?
Yeah.
Yes, you are now.
Perfect. Hey, Christian, thank you for your comment. You know, I still like structure though. So, you know, I have to say I'm a bit chaotic person. Like I like, you know, holding a lot of balls in the air and then somehow manage in the end. But if there is someone, you know, compensating that strengths me, I do not follow like structuring things so you can compensate. No, thank you for showing that. I think, you know, it's very true what John said about the role the leaders want to take in the future, and that they're very clear about that. What their role and what is their task, what is the leader they want to become. So, I mean, we can see in the ideal, the ideal behavior is how they want to impact others to behave in certain ways is not really fitting with the reality, right? Yeah. So probably there is this point of what you said, the employees would like to be heard. So what is then the leader role, you know, based on the demand the teams has, where probably they have to start, you know, practicing techniques, how to listen correctly, to give people not only the feeling of being heard, but taking action out of that, maybe just telling less and asking more. So I think, you know, that this comes good together with the role John said. And now just looking to the list, right? The question is how they can embody this in their day-to-day and it's not just feeling on top. And if I'm seeing the structure, you know, I had a great executive coach who always told me, this is not set up for success if there's so much on the roadmap. So it's just too much, and who should drive that in the end of the day? Yeah. So that I take this always with me. So when I'm planning something, maybe they can decide for themselves and reflect what are the things that has highest priority for us and our teams. Because if the teams are not there, probably they're also not that efficient in making the money they want to do. So maybe that's a good reflection to go ahead with and let them reflect, let them discover, let them discuss, and then ask about the so what. Yeah, it's good. That's really good. Your point about active listening is also really, I mean, just 2 points. One point, John, that you raised, then Ali, linking it to your point. What I loved is if you allow the current steep gradient to drive the change process, you're going to have it's just going to fail. I mean, you can't have a situation where senior leaders are making decisions on setting the culture. I mean, it's just completely doesn't make any sense at all. So in some ways they can't, if they behave the way they've always behaved with all other transactional work, this thing's going to fail. So I think that's a very powerful message to deliver. And Ali, your point as well about giving them, I mean, I think the point about active listening is really important. It's a basic skill I hadn't thought about. I think it's spot on. And also giving them the choice. I mean, I'm also very unstructured. I draw these pictures to convince myself that I actually am, but it's a serious exercise in compensation. You know, if my wife were to look at this, she'd burst out laughing. The point though is that, you know, the impetus for having this to happen has to come from the client. The client has to buy into it and has to, I mean, ultimately I want this to be successful. I'm probably as invested in their success as they are, but that can get in the way. I really have to have the patience to sit back and say,
it's yours. I can help you, but I can't actually force. I mean, there's no point me being sort of oppositional on top of the leaders being oppositional. I really have to give them space. I really have to give them space to own this and grow into it. So your point about slow it down, let them prioritize, learn to listen myself, model the kind of listening that they then will have to exercise with their own people is very insightful.
Yeah. So Christian, it's not on your shoulders. All answers are in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah, but sometimes you want somebody who sort of coaxes them to look into the right corner of the room. To your point of as somebody who's flying by the seat of the pants and using one PowerPoint slide to run a one-day workshop, very much like Ali, I'm very impressed with your structured swimline. And as a team type monitor evaluator who steals stuff where he can see it, I will select next project. So thank you for that. To the point of boredom of your clients in terms of they've done all the surveys and they're not interested in doing any more. My point would be, and following up on the discussion that we just had, make it relevant to them. And rather than giving them the information and wait for them to come up with something, what I usually do is I start trying to make it relevant to them with them. What I mean by that is, for example, shadow individual leaders either with their peers or with their teammates. I have facilitated leadership meetings on day-to-day subjects, and basically sort of told them or gave them an opportunity to test out constructive behavior in their day-to-day environment. Make it relevant to what they do every day and take them out of the workshop situation. Yeah, we've spent a day on culture, great, good fun. Now I'm going back into my day-to-day life with my teams and my peers and my clients and many of the difficult people that I need to deal with. And I'm falling back into my day-to-day, my normal behavior patterns that I employ daily. We can do something against that, either by buddy coaching, set up teams between two people to help them if you can't do it yourself. Be available for them on the phone on set dates to coach them through situation to plan their week, for example. Make an offering in terms of, we can do this together. I can provide you with ways of doing it without dictating them what to do, but help them sort of turn the concept of constructive behavior into real experiences.
Yeah, that's really good. Well,
yeah, it's if they can feel the behavior, that makes a whole difference. We talk a lot about, I even think I have a video, did a webinar a while ago about sort of different exercises, games that we can use to not just communicate, the patterns and styles of behavior we measure, but give people the chance to sort of feel it and experience it. And that's where a lot of the, the learning comes when we, this personally, we recognize how this is happening and what effect it has on myself. And that's good.
Cool.
Sorry to interrupt. I had a couple points to add to it. One of them is along the lines that, again, we can't push this change on organizations or teams or leaders. It needs to be a pull. So as much as we can, again, focusing on this is the change that they are asking for, right? Not that we are prescribing to them. So sometimes when I talk to clients, I'm usually trying to, as I said before, connect our models to performance KPI things, show them how this is going to help drive high performance in their teams and people, try to connect this to values in terms of how this represents living our values. But sometimes the third thing I will also try to include is a personal benefit for themselves. This works at all levels. But, you know, it's one thing to do this for, you know, the organization and its values and our KPIs and customers. But sometimes people really, you know, to get enthusiastic and feel that they need to feel a little skin in the game. And so it's really helpful to talk about, you know, moving forward, what do you wish was different in your role? And you'll hear from leaders that they wish they had a little better work-life balance, or they wish their team was a little more proactive or communicative or whatever. And that's absolutely the kind of, you know, synergistic benefit that we see from culture development. You see that it not only improves the way that our organization functions and teams, but it really affects the well-being of people. So we can connect that personal, you know, and you hear this as we develop more constructive norms. My team is more proactive. We have better, open, more consistent communication, so that leaders are recognizing this isn't just a benefit to the business and others, but I have a benefit to this as well. And that's honestly true at all levels. I love to go to any teach department, talk about, well, how does this change going to affect you? What do you want to see this leading toward? And then again, people are seeing this as a path forward to what we want. And that's a lot of the pull is very, very helpful. So getting those personal motivations.
And again, in this context, it's not just this client. I mean, this is a universal feature of East African businesses, is that you have this stupendous individual stress, people putting themselves under ridiculous pressure, working 24/7, fetishizing this kind of work. And it's like, this can't be healthy. You can't be enjoying this. And so it's basically, to your point, framing those benefits. It's also giving them the sensitivity or the awareness to be delighted by their team. Because it's not just that their team is going to delight them, because chances are their team's desperately trying to delight them. They just cannot see it. So it's sort of like, because they're not asking the right questions, or because they are blindsided by tiny, tiny details that don't matter. And they don't say, oh my God, someone actually took a punt at this. So it's teaching them to see joy where really joy may be already. It might be in the room, as you said.
And maybe, Christian, if I may, just a last thought on that. And since I joined late, please just stop me if you've said it already. I think what is so powerful here, and something that we love to use, is nudging. I love the book Nudge. I love the nudge unit. I love the whole idea around just subtly reminding people in very small doses on some good behavior patterns and prompting questions. But I especially love it when you connect it with, did you know that 80% of leaders in our organization, or 65% of leaders, are you among? Language like that, and give them prompting questions that actually help them reflect on exactly the points you just raised. Right? When was the last time you were delighted by your team? Did you tell them why not? Something like that. This is something we use a lot, and we used a lot of digital sales funneling techniques to combine it with desired outcomes around leadership behaviors. So this is just a small nugget to add.
Awesome. That's really, really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I like that as well. And it kind of goes to the point of one of the things you said earlier was you might get the sense that development plan that you had up was, you know, your clients might feel a little overwhelmed with all of these things. And that's, you know, every organization is a bit different on that. So in my experience, you try to get a gauge of, you know, what, but it's not about changing everything. So I would be careful of and caution around overwhelming leaders. And especially early on in this, we need to take, I like to say, baby steps in the beginning and slowly build this. If it feels overwhelming, that's might not be sustainable. It's helpful to start small. I usually try to, you know, almost under ask from the client. We're going to do very small things and do those things consistently. It's not about changing the whole system it's about doing small steps, but doing them consistently. And those are the patterns that make the difference. And once we can do those little things and then it, you know, sort of blends into how we work, then we can add more to this. And it helps to prevent this from feeling overwhelming while still creating patterns. The other point I would make is that means it's slower, sure, right? We're going to not overwhelm. We're going to break this into, and the journey is perhaps slower as a consequence. Now, I did another webinar, and there's a recording on ways to accelerate culture development, speed up this kind of change. But the point is that if we can take those small steps and do it consistently, then we really should be able to create, drive that change in a way that feels not threatening, but as a learning opportunity, as something we can try out. As we do it, we notice positive results, and it builds and becomes that snowball pattern moving forward. So,
got it. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Very nice. Thank you so much. Fantastic insights and great discussion. So thank you all so far. I think we've actually come to our first our break for today. So I think everybody may be ready for 10 minutes, a little break, and then we'll come back and continue with Sabine's content. So thank you so much for everyone who is joining online. If there are any questions during the next 10 minutes, please feel free. Great opportunity to go ahead and type those into the chat, and we'll be happy to discuss those as a panel. So thank you all for joining, and we'll just take a 10-minute break and see you again. Thank you.
All good. Cheers.
Thank you. Hello and welcome back to our Human Synergistics Roundtable. I hope everybody had a good break. Thank you again for everyone tuning in and participating. Again, if there are any questions, comments, please feel free to type those into our chat. So we're still roughly on time, and very happy to be able to welcome today to our stage Miss Sabine Gromer of MagnoliaTree to talk about the very common and fascinating topic of the frozen middle, the middle level management as an obstacle to the driver of leadership and culture change. So please join me in welcoming Sabine Gromer to the stage. Thank you so much for joining us today on this key topic.
Thank you, John. Really excited to be with you all.
Fantastic. Thank you. So it's a common question and a common challenge. Happy to tell you some data we see in organizations around that. But let's start with your perspectives and looking forward to it. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the data, actually, because it is a common topic. But I will actually posit my assumption around it as well. I think it's a myth and stereotype that is a generalization that I haven't found to be true. But they say never start a talk with bad news, and this is exactly what I'm about to do. In fact, I'm going to add on some bad news. We all know the statistics. The last one that I've seen is probably about 10 years old, that says that 2/3 of all culture change or change efforts fail. And I would say in the last couple of years, certainly since the pandemic, things have only gotten worse. Why? Because it's a lot harder to implement culture change in a remote setting. So when people actually don't come together physically anymore, we know that this is a hindrance to any culture journey. The second piece is loyalty has shifted, and we know that there is currently, at least in the DACH region, the highest level of opportunistic openness to change careers, to change jobs. In fact, in a very recent study conducted by Ernst & Young in late 2023, about 63% of employees asked that question, whether they are ready to jump ship or to take on another job in another organization. 63% of the people who were asked said that they were actually open to that, and roughly 1/3 was actively looking. So we also have a bit of a challenge that we cannot rely on the employee-employer contract that was probably broken by the employers a while ago, but was still active and strong in many parts of the Western world. until very, very recently. And then, of course, we all know that culture change also takes time. It takes 6 to 9 years. And typically, most organizations don't allow themselves that time to really implement any changes. And we know that in order to influence change, we also must understand the key forces that drive change. And I hope I'm not repeating something that was already said, but there are just 3 items and 3 forces that I find really helpful to put in context when we talk about leadership and when we talk about influencing leaders in a change journey. The first piece for me is entropy. It really states that every system is trying to prolong its lifespan, but is ultimately moving towards its own end and towards its own death. I personally find this as liberating a thought, as scary thought, but we have to understand that members and people in systems inherently understand that their key task in the group as an individual and probably also as a system is to secure survival for as long as possible. So the second force that we need to understand is that when people act in a certain way, they don't do it out of malice. They don't do it with bad intent. They actually do it in the best way they know how to survive in a system, and probably also in the best way they at least subconsciously think the system will survive. So this is the second piece that I wanted to add to the discussion. And the third driver that I think is really important in culture change is homeostasis. Homeostasis means nothing else than any system usually has a base state that it tries to move back to. And the analogy that I often use for that is that of a mobile. Mobile is a construct that you can hit as hard as you want to, and it will probably be unbalanced for some time, but it will always come down in the same state that you found it in. And I think this is very true for most organizations and most systems. So to understand that force any system to go back to the base state, the state that we know, is also quite an important force. So what do we actually need to do in order to just generally make change successful and onboard leaders? And I think in my definition, one of the items that is really important is that we do not need all the leaders in the system. Actually, we love to work with the tipping point leaders approach. And tipping point leaders approach just means nothing else than you need 33% of any level of hierarchy to really implement the change. So when we talk about middle management, you don't need 50%, you don't need 100%. 33% is probably sufficient. And the second point, even though I missed his talk, I'm sure Ali talked about the element of what we also need to do in order to be successful on every layer of the organization, but especially around the mid-level of leadership, is we have to start a movement. Some kind of a movement, some kind of a community, a bonding experience that actually helps us in that, because that can become another driving factor. And then the third piece is that I believe we also have to reflect on privilege and power and how that is distributed. Because in a central or general approach in culture change approaches that I've observed and I've personally experienced in previous roles as well, is that usually we're very tempted to work with what we feel is the center of power in any system. And the center of power in a system could be a function. For example, it could be the trading or people on the trading floor, or it could be everybody in the sales force. Usually corporations have an epicenter of power that is most privileged in the ranking order, has top position. And typically as consultants, we are quite drawn to that function, because we believe when we change that function, the rest of the system will organically follow on. And maybe subconsciously, we also know that budgets are higher in that function too. I'm just speculating here. But our approach, and the approach that I'm trying to posit when we talk about mid-level leaders, the frozen middle, and when we generally talk about change today, is that we need to reverse that formula. I believe it's really important to understand that we implement change best in a system when we actually work with members of the organization that don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, they have the feeling that their voice doesn't count as much. And why is that? Well, basically because they have a lot more upside, they have a lot more skin in the game in gaining betterment for themselves, actually members and leaders in the organization's epicenter of power. So it becomes unsettling when suddenly you reverse the power dynamics in that way, when you actually work with a part of the business that has not gotten all the resources, all the attention. It is a little bit like raising 2 or 3 children when you suddenly favor one child over the other, and it's actually different. I mean, you should never, in psychology, you should never favor one child over the other. But many parents do, so you might understand the analogy, right? If you have a favorite child, and then suddenly you take spotlight away from that child and you actually move it on to the other child, it unsettles the whole system, the whole family system, and the same will be true in the organization. So to understand the center of power and to understand the privilege and to shift that will also help us when we think about the so-called frozen middle, and when we think about that that part of the organization. So with that introduction and my general thoughts on how to approach these type of changes, I just want to talk to you a bit about middle management and what are some of the driving forces for them, but maybe also why are they often perceived as restraining forces, if you just stay with Kurt Levin's force field analysis analogy. What's really special about that layer of management is, one, of course, they have worked incredibly hard to get to this level. And they did it in the way that they best found how in the way to navigate the labyrinth. They had to train themselves in certain behavior patterns. They had to adopt certain status symbols. They had to show habits and actions that actually spoke to whatever the currency is in the system, probably the system you want to change. So they trained themselves for many years to be successful and to work hard at race to the top or a race to the hierarchy. Because in many systems, this is still seen as a level of achievement. So there's status privilege, but also working hard to get there. The second piece of element that I think is special, especially around this layer of management, is that we know roughly about 70% of all adults in the workplace will at some stage feel feelings of imposterism in their career. Feelings of imposterism basically means I believe I don't deserve to be at the level where I'm at, and I'm fearful or I'm worried that I will be called out at any point in time. Now, we know that these feelings of imposterism are even more intense at certain levels of hierarchy, especially at the level of hierarchy where you don't drive strategy forward, but also you still are in a sandwich and you still get a lot of pressure from the organization. And I think that that is the third characteristic that is really special about this layer of hierarchy, because they are at the receiving end of strategy. They often did not have a seat at the table in driving that, but they're expected to implement it in the best way possible, while, and I think this is my fourth point around what is characteristic for them, they actually have and experience the same level of doubt, frustrations, concerns, apprehension, and maybe even passivity than many of their colleagues in other parts of the hierarchy or in other parts of the organization. But they have to be at the helm of this. They're often introduced to the organization as being the people who implement the change. And they are also in a very powerful position, unlike many of their other colleagues, unless they really create a strong lobby or alliance against the change. They can actually prevent the change because they have status and privilege enough in the system to do that. And they can do it in many different ways. The most common one is that we just resist it. We just pretend that we are on board, but actually we don't really put our best effort forward in implementing it. And because they have that power, And because they are such a multiplier, this is why I believe in analysis, and I'm really interested in John, in your findings on this. I believe this is why they become so visible as a layer of hierarchy, and they're often probably also blamed. So setting us up in the definition of what makes them special, I prepared for today just a list of 10 items that I recommend that you consider when you're about to think about leadership changes and or culture changes. They actually go for both scenarios, because you cannot do a leadership change without a culture change, and you can't really do a culture change without a leadership change. So in my definition of the world, they certainly really go together. I think the first piece that we always have to keep in mind is that when we get frustrated about behavior patterns of leaders in the organization, we have to understand the definition of behavior. And the definition of behavior is the function of the personality and the environment, while the P for personality is actually in small letters. The environment is in capital letters in that formula, because the environment really determines how we show up, how we engage, and how we push something forward. So when you see leaders in general engage in activities, habits, behaviors that are not healthy, for example, oppositional behavior or avoidant behavior, we just have to be mindful that the organization is playing a really big part in them showing up that way. And I think the climate factors that you offer and the analysis that you offer in human synergistics is very impactful to look at some of the underlying dynamics. But very specifically for the so-called frozen middle, what is my recommendation? What are things that we try to do at MagnoliaTree when we want to work with them and we want to create allyship and a tipping point leader movement? So when we aim for 33% of the hierarchy layer, the first piece is that we try to demystify the frozen middle myth, and I call it a myth. Because I believe it's often a very common stereotype, and it could be a very common reasoning. So what we try to do is we actually try to talk to leaders in that organization about the myth, and we try to clear it up, especially with top executives and senior leaders. So this would be my first recommendation, to do that. In fact, we are hosting a leadership conference next week with a client where we get 200 of their top leaders together, and we will do a keynote around the frozen middle as well, and we will talk about it with the whole leadership team. The second recommendation that I have is, what can you do to improve the context? So for example, can you offer coaching to the middle manager's manager? Because very often we offer training and coaching to the middle management, and that might be helpful. But if we can't shift the context, it's going to be really difficult for somebody to really change their own behavior and their own pattern, especially in that level of hierarchy. So really consider coaching the seniors. The third piece is also think about elements and ways to reduce strategic ambiguity. The clearer you can be in your strategy and the clearer you can be in what you want to achieve, the easier it will be for them to align with you, and the less room you leave for interpretation, for gossip, for uncertainties. Actually, one of the most important factors for me is my next point. I think it's really important that you reduce the fear and the anxiety in this layer of hierarchy. And one big recommendation that I have for executive boards when I work with them is, and we've actually been successful in implementing it twice, is to secure every leader on that layer that in their job safety. So make sure to say, we're at the beginning of a transformation, beginning of a change. And I know this is an untypical and non-standard recommendation, but I think it's really helpful to give a commitment for a duration of time, a year to 2 years, and say, we want to keep all of you middle managers on board during that time. It will sound strange to many of your ears, but it works beautifully. Why? Because you help set them up with a level of safety and security. And you could even tell them that over the year or the year and a half, you really evaluate their contribution in this change, and that will be a really big determining factor for their position, for their career in the future. So a bit of a controversial recommendation, but one that we have tested and that generally works very well. The next recommendation that I have is, I think it's important to create habits of action. And one of the case studies that I love to quote on that is the ICOA story, that some of you might know because Charles Duhigg wrote about it in his book, not Atomic Habits. I think The Power of Habit was the title of his book. And he talks about how Paul O'Neill, as a senior executive, as a CEO, joined the ICOA board. And he introduced a goal, a KPI around 0 injuries. And he introduced that together with a number of keystone habits, where he created the frame for leaders to report any incidents, but also at the same time to already offer the solution to the problem, which meant that leaders of production sites actually had to collaborate a lot more with one another. They had to exchange on ideas. They had to ask the workforce for ideas. A story, a case study like this might be helpful to understand what I'm trying to recommend here. It's really about what is one common action, one common habit, one common behavior that you could instill across the organization, but then invite these leaders, these mid-level leaders in to contribute, to participate and to co-create the strategy with you around that element. And what could be the equivalent for that in your system? That might be worth mulling it over. Then, of course, we also have to acknowledge that these leaders oftentimes experience system overload. They're usually tired and exhausted, and they feel that they have too many responsibilities. So is it possible for you in your system to create a reflection Monday morning or a reflection Friday afternoon? Is it possible to instill time in the diaries when there won't be any appointments, any meetings? And you actually recommend to your mid-level leaders that they take this 1 hour, this 2 hours, to really use it for reflection and to sit and reflect on what's going on, some of the elements that they see in the change, some of the adjustments they might need to do. And then, of course, I also believe that when we do train this level of leadership, we need to be aware of the traditional trajectory of getting to mid-level leaders in many traditional organizations, because that usually includes something like, I'm the biggest expert on the job, I serve long enough, I've proven my abilities, and I get recognized because the career path is usually a people leader's career path. So I actually get recognized in that. And as I get recognized, I'm then promoted into managerial and leadership positions. So oftentimes they're unfortunately not the most natural born leaders, even though they don't exist, but they are not skilled and they're not rewarded necessarily for their type of leadership. So of course, training is important on that layer, but what I'm positing is that training and coaching should include 3 different elements. It should include essentials around change leadership. So what do we really need to do to change a system? Some of the introductory remarks that I made, some of the driving forces that you will encounter, and how you can shift communities and create a movement. They definitely need to know that. They also probably need some training around leadership. But the third piece is the piece that I'm usually missing in these training initiatives and that I only recommend, which is, can you really talk to them about group dynamics? Can you teach them to have an X-ray view on what's going on in their organization, in their area of responsibility, and make sure that they really understand that a lot of behavior that might frustrate them and in return will make them feel alien to their own organization are actually quite normal, and how to navigate them and how to mitigate them. And my last 2 points really are around, can you create validation and recognition for them? Oftentimes, this is also the layer that is not rewarded in the same way. And I don't mean a company-wide party or a Christmas gift, a holiday gift for everybody. And I don't mean bonuses with that. I mean real personal validation and recognition for each individual in that hierarchy level. So how can you help senior leaders, their bosses, to really see their impact and to actually recognize the impact in a personal way that really matters to the individual manager? And then my last is, could you also think about creating a routine of not just listening to that level of management, because oftentimes it's painful to listen to them. They have a lot of concerns. They're usually worried about why things might or might not work. But could you also prompt them, maybe in the nudge way that I mentioned earlier, but could you also prompt them to, whenever they come to you and they want to vent or they want to share with you what's on their mind and what concerns them, could you also make sure that they always provide their own recommendation and their own solution? Because in doing so, you do two things. You invite them to participate in a different way, but you also give them a prompt to change some of their action and behaviors. When they have to think about solution, they're more likely to become a part of the movement you want to create. So this is, John, where I would close my thoughts around the so-called frozen middle and middle management.
Absolutely. Thank you. Very, very nice. A wonderful list of recommendations. Thank you. Let's not close it. I think it's a great topic. And again, one we talk to clients consistently about. I agree that that's a part of the organization that's unique and needs to be addressed in a bit different ways than what we roll out at leadership levels and other areas of the business. You're right. It's a unique part of the organization. That mid-level really is, functionally trying to fulfill not only expectations upward in terms of what our leaders are, but also the expectations of those people whom we're serving and leading as managers in the middle. So it's a very dynamic sort of position to be in organizations. The statistic you started with, the 2/3 of organizational systemic development fails. That sounds horrifying, but I have to say it's better than the last statistic I've heard. I think it was several years ago. I think it was Harvard Business Review published 80% of organizational culture systemic development fails. And I always say that I don't doubt that that's the case, unfortunately. However, we can truly demonstrate that within our own client base, the organizations we work with, we're actually seeing the opposite statistic. We're seeing 80% of our clients able to create real, sustainable, positive change in that system. And I always say, I honestly believe the only reason we see 80% success versus 80% failure is that our clients are basing their development and decisions in terms of where we put our efforts and resources on good data that's telling them the truth. Otherwise, without that kind of framework and methodology, we're essentially guessing based on what we believe we need to do in the organization to send a different message to our people, encourage a different norm to drive a different outcome. And that is these systems are extremely complex and dynamic, and it is, I think, a best case, it's guesswork in terms of where we think we need to put our efforts. And the other thing I always see, and very often see, is that clients have in the past have continued to put their efforts in the same places and overlook parts of the system that need development desperately. And that's the reason they're failing, right? They're always thinking.
Exactly.
They're always,
they place it in the power epicenters, and I think this is exactly the wrong approach, because you have so much to lose if you are in these entities. Why would you be motivated, intrinsically motivated for the change, if you know that you're the top dog in the system? You wouldn't.
Exactly.
Completely agree.
Right. And we need to have a system where everyone feels that they have a place and a purpose, not, a part of the organization that people are struggling to get to try to create that sense of security. So, right. So that's one thing, is having that transparency. I think it is really absolutely key. Again, organizations will consistently put their efforts in the same places. In my experience, that's leadership development. Nothing wrong with that. Leaders are key. We've got to coach leaders in order to shift culture. Absolutely. But it's not only leadership. And they'll put efforts in other places. Another one that's quite common is mission and philosophy. So we'll talk a lot about what our mission is, what our values are, what our purpose is. We'll continue to reinvest in rewriting our mission, redefining it. And those are important levers as well. But unfortunately, that organization will overlook other factors that are preventing people from behaving in the ways that we'd like. So it's wonderful to have that systemic perspective.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you. I just wanted to jump in. I believe I said it in the webinar we did with Ali's colleague Anya. I don't know, probably a year ago or 1.5 years ago. I think I said it then as well, right? I'm really not a big fan of mission statements and prescribed values because they just don't yield an impact. It's great for agencies. They usually cost a lot of money, cost a lot of time for sure. But to really live them and to really fill them with life, with meaningful life that is important for the change that you want to instill or the culture you want to create, I've just not seen it work. There's very few organizations that I think of that really made it work and worth the effort. So I love that you also said, as a side note, this is what people try to do, but this is not going to be what wins the challenge of changing your culture, your leadership, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It takes much more than that. One of the things I like to say about values is it's communicating what we expect from employees, but you can't tell people how to behave. You have to encourage behavior. And that is much more than a value statement. And here's what we expect. In data, to be honest with you, I've always been fascinated with mission and philosophy because we measure that in organizational climate, as you know, along with 31 other things that influence culture. And it's not just our values and our leaders, it's how we set goals and how jobs are designed and how we recognize employee. It's a whole system. And what's really interesting about value statements and mission and purpose is that in organizational systems, that can either be the most impactful factor of the entire system, or it can be the least impactful when we literally looking at things like correlation analyses. Because you can write your vision and mission and purpose statement, and if that's essentially all that you do to encourage that behavior, leaders are role modeling other things. We're not, you're right. So we say we want creativity, but we don't role model it. We don't reward it. We don't design jobs in a way that enable it. So in that case, that mission and philosophy statement is going to have almost no impact on the current operating culture of the organization, because all we're doing is saying, not encouraging. On the other hand, you find organizations who are more effective in utilizing and leveraging that mission and value statement to guide how we do and structure the other 30 climate factors. So if we say we're all about creativity and collaboration, then we better be role modeling it as leaders. We better be rewarding it when people are doing those things and say, good job, that's what we're looking for, that's good work. We need to design jobs so that people can functionally be creative and understand how to do that in their work. If we use the vision and mission to align how we structurally design climate, you'll absolutely get that in your culture. Then your values are the most powerful factor of the whole system. But it's all about, okay, really interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And you mentioned some statistics, right? You have some statistics about the frozen middle.
Yes, sorry, that was what. So in OCI Ideal, so we have the instrument that asks organizations what kind of culture they would like to have in an ideal case, so that they can describe that for themselves. In that instrument, we basically ask two types of questions. The first questions are what kind of behavior should be taking place, is ideal and appropriate. The second kind of questions we ask in that inventory are what we call readiness for change questions. And these ask a couple of different questions, but essentially the ones that are connecting to this topic directly are, we ask, that kind of culture that you just described, the ideal, to what extent would that kind of culture be supported and facilitated by senior level leaders? To what extent would that be supported by mid-level management? And to what extent would that be supported by staff levels of the organization? So we're asking people throughout the business this, and you're really getting a sense of not only their perception of who's enthusiastic and willing to carry this out, but it really does tell you, what part of the organization is really ready for this change and willing to contribute. So unfortunately, one of the most common patterns that I see, now, typically all of these scores are very high. Meaning, yes, leaders want this kind of change, so do managers and would support and so on. But if there's a differentiation, many times it is the mid-level that I see has a little lower scores on enthusiasm. I just went through two client reports yesterday looking at this. And in fact, in both cases, mid-level managers were a bit lower than the rest in terms of their readiness for this kind of development. So that certainly doesn't mean we can't create this change. It just means there's a little bit more hesitation and perhaps concern or insecurity within that level of the business about this. And I think there are a variety of reasons for it. And second, I'll bring our other experts on, happy to hear from them, of course. But part of it, I think, is that, historically, perhaps in these organizations, development was sort of delegated from leaders to management. It's your, occasionally you've heard this, right? In the past, we need to shift our culture, management, OD department, you go make that happen and do it. And so they're, sort of being put in an unrealistic position. Anyway, and if those initiatives, by the way, in the past have not been successful, it's the mid-level management who's being held accountable for that. So, I think, so I think with a pattern of that over time, then you're creating.
Even though, John, they don't just become the scapegoat. Their longevity is usually a lot longer. Their loyalty in the organization is usually a lot longer, right? So you have executives that they can churn every 4 years or so. But but the blame is not on that, but the blame is actually on this level. So I'm quite relieved that you say it's a bit different, because you would expect that, right? You would expect that the layer that holds power but is not influential enough to drive the change or to craft a strategy, that they would be the ones most resistant to the change. That makes sense in a group dynamics way, but that it's not so dramatic. I think this is quite interesting. So thank you for sharing that too. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and what it does really is it empowers the people who use these tools, hopefully like yourself and others. So because what it's telling you really is not only that there's a little hesitation, but we need to act on that information and provide a little more support, a little more guidance to management. And that's very good to know as we're getting in, before we, get into creating change, where the enthusiasm is and where the hesitation might be, so that we can try to create that clarity and security for these people so that they can move forward. And that was one of my other points. You mentioned before that in organizations, people are seeking that security, trying to survive within the system. And that is true. But I really think there are two categories. We first need to make sure we can survive within the system, and then we can grow and thrive within that system. And that's really that line between security orientation, survival versus growth, learning, development, achievement, and so on. So, and there you go. So if our mid-level managers are just trying to survive in this organization and its culture, that does not bode well for their ability to proactively guide the organization forward, be effective so we need to address and create that security for them, so they're not just trying to survive, but can apply themselves in the most effective and productive ways for the business. The last thing I'll say, and then I'm sorry, I'm going too far, but is you mentioned that it takes 6 to 9 years to create this kind of change. Again, happy to talk about that for the most part. You're, of course, absolutely right. There's a whole topic around how we can accelerate culture change, which is a big theme of mine. So there are ways to speed this up, but it also goes back to one of Christian's points and some of our earlier discussion around, well, sometimes, yes, it is little steps forward. But as far as I'm concerned, as long as we're taking steps forward, we're getting somewhere. The problem is that in most organizations, the 80% or the 2/3 or whatever it is, they're not going anywhere. They're sort of, bumping into walls and not making any progress forward. And I would much rather take baby steps forward and actually get somewhere than not. And that's a message I try to bring across to leaders, especially once we deliver good data and reports, that look, you basically have two choices here. You can either choose, with this understanding, you can either choose to learn from this, do something with this, act on this, communicate this, and create something more positive moving forward, regardless of how quickly that happens. Or you can essentially choose to maintain the status quo, continue what we're doing right now, and in that case, we're just going to see the same outcome. So it's your choice to either guide the organization forward and lead that culture, or again, essentially to reinforce the existing pattern and stay standing where we are. So slow progress may be frustrating, but at least it's progress.
And for our viewers and listeners, actually, there's a two-piece document that I really recommend that you published that I find really helpful to test whether I'm moving forward or I'm going around in circles as an organization. And that is the stages of evolutions papers you published, because you have such clear criteria in them around self-assessing, where am I at right now, and what do I need to lift the organization to the next level, which sometimes is really frustrating, because I might have to expend 60 or 70% of energy just the other 20 or 30% shift in the change. And I love how this document maps it out, and I think this is going to be quite helpful for a lot of people. So we certainly use it a lot in our advisory practice.
I'm glad that's helpful. Yeah, that's very, very kind of fascinating content once you really understand what it is. Yeah, very, very nice. Yes. Thank you. Good to hear. So I would like to welcome the rest of our presenters to the stage, Christian, Jochen, and Ali. Thank you so much. So interested in your insights and perspectives.
So maybe,
yes, sir.
I'll just try and sort of pick one thing out, if I may. You talk about the middle management as the frozen layer. My experience was that they're actually quite flexible in terms of siding, either with the senior management or with their peers rather than their co-workers. So pinpointing them to get their perspective on what would they really like to do is clearly, depending on the organization that you're working with, a difficult subject. How do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, I agree, right? I think the term frozen middle is really stereotyping and misleading. So I think we're completely aligned there. And I think it gets more in the way of understanding them. But when you say, and it makes a lot of sense what you say, right? Of course, they lean, because they're in such a sandwich. Of course, they have to, on the one hand, they have to make sure that they please the seniors, and at the same time, they also have to make sure that they bond and connect with the organization and, the people that report into them. But say a bit more about your question, because I'm not quite sure that I got that completely, Jochen. So what is your question? How would I deal with what? If you could just give me a bit more context on that, that would be great.
Or deal with the behavior of managers.
I'm so sorry.
You can't pinpoint them sometimes. Yeah. Can you hear me again?
It might just be on my end, Jochen. I just, you phase in and out. I'm so sorry. I had this earlier on as well, but I believe Jochen meant how to pinpoint where they're at in the journey. Is that, yeah?
I'm happy to reiterate that. What I'm trying to work out is how can we get the manager level to develop a stance of their own running through a cultural reorganization, rather than sitting in the sandwich. I want this piece of beef between the burger patties to go out and sort of develop their own view, and therefore be a driving force, both for the management above them to tell them this is the situation, this is reality. Get away from your rosy view of the blue organization that you believe we have, and at the same time fill the role of the leader, defending their workforce in terms of what they need to do. So how do we do that?
Perfect. Jochen, I'm so grateful. And now I could hear you fully and could understand the question. And I'm not just saying this because we're the Human Synergistics call an expert panel. I'm really saying it because I mean it. We like to use the leadership impact assessment for that. Why? Because the leadership impact assessment really helps leaders to understand the impact they create with their behavior. And it's the only tool that I know that actually does that. It's not a typical 300.
Why are you using leadership impact? That's for C-level. we're talking about the level below, which would be
No.
MI.
No, we actually use it for senior leaders as well, N-1, and in some organizations N-2 as well.
Okay.
So it depends on the span, and typically for most organizations, the frozen middle would actually have managers reporting into them. So it is really the mid-level, and then of course you have a choice. But typically for that layer, we certainly use the leadership impact because it drives a bit more towards the strategy and the implementation. And I really enjoy using that tool because many leaders are not aware. One, they might be aware of the tension they have to hold within the system, just like you said, because they have to pivot to one side or the other. But they are certainly not aware of the impact that they have and the impact they create on their organization and how their behaviors really impact that. So I love that tool just to help them understand and hold up a mirror. And in our experience, this really triggers a lot of self-reflection, a lot of frustration sometimes as well. But paired with coaching, we have seen some really incredible results. So this would be an approach that I really recommend.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful to help mid-level management see how impactful they are. You know, sometimes people kind of get the concept that it's only the senior leaders who are driving things, but you know, everyone with authority has an influence, and managers drive anyway. So it's very powerful for them to. And I love that. Right, the tool is phenomenal because not only can we see how we're influencing others, but that's at a personal level. It's what am I doing, and what effect is that having on the people that I lead, and how is that influencing the way they work? So it makes it very, very, very tangible and actionable. Another piece I wanted to jump in with in terms of the frozen middle concept is, you know, when I think about the network of coaches and consultants such as yourselves that we work with, when I talk to end user clients about the benefit of our accredited consultants, a lot of those benefits actually are in a way targeted at mid-level. I mean, one of the big benefits of having external consultants is, look, you're the people who've done this before. You've used these instruments in organizations to create change successfully. A lot of times that, you know, the mid-level of that organization, you know, they've never done this. These are new concepts to them. It's the first time they're ever perhaps, you know, and it's tremendously helpful to unfreeze that middle by giving them some support of people who, again, have that experience and knowledge to directly bring in and support that middle in shift. The other thing that our consultant network is tremendously helpful for is, you know, giving direct feedback to senior leaders, coaching them, challenging their assumptions. And again, that kind of thing can be difficult from the middle as well. And I think part of the reason that they may be resistant to this change is anyway, but having those external coaches, consultants who can help unfreeze the middle by both providing your experience and you know, being able to address senior leaders from an external perspective is a great way to help support that part of the organization.
I was reflecting a little bit on firstly, this conversation is fascinating, and I love the sort of our ability to talk about very big complex systems in this way. It's amazing. I mean, I was reminded of a phrase that, you know, people say, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And this is a challenge with middle managers. I mean, the ally piece is great because it gives you an opportunity to exercise a bit more power and influence within your sphere of influence. So I think allies can be very important for unlocking the people below you and maybe enhancing your lateral relationships. But if you're in a dysfunctional organization, which is super political, and where your senior leaders jockey for influence and power and see you as expendable, then if you're a middle manager, no amount of personal ally is going to help. I mean, you really have to find. I mean, again, this is sort of the analogy that Jochen raised of, you know, if this is the burger in the middle trying to escape the two buns, like how do we get middle managers to be the really powerful out there leaders? I mean, you're asking chickens to go run in a field when there are hawks above them. I mean, it's a terrifying thing to be expecting of people, because there's so many examples of chickens that ran into the field and got eaten. So, you know, the challenge is in organizations which have long entrenched political cultures. Simply saying to people, be bolder, be braver, run out of the trench. I mean, sure, they're going to get blown to bits. So, I mean, as consultants, you know, what duty of care do you have to these folk? How do you help them be successful and hit that? I mean, once you get to the 30-40%, then hopefully dysfunctional people at higher levels will read the writing on the wall and find an organization that rewards their behavior. So you can get to a critical mass. I guess for me, what's fascinating is in situations where you don't have much power, but you are smart and you want to be successful, you know, how can you be as constructive? It's sort of like, what's the limit? What's the threshold? You can be constructive, but if you're too constructive, it's not going to work. It's going to crash around you. So just how do you give people guidance to find that critical threshold of constructive behavior without exposing themselves to personal risk? That's something I'm fascinated by.
Yeah, sorry, I've got to jump in. That's an old story in human synergistics. You know, we started measuring psychological and behavioral patterns in individuals and coaching and developing individuals to think and behave in more constructive ways that drive better health and well-being outcomes, performance outcomes for them. But what we learned was there's some challenge to that. And one of the challenges isn't the individual, but the context of the individual. You can talk to people all day about being curious and right, goal-oriented and taking ownership. But if they're in that environment that's insecure, again, if they're just trying to survive within the organization, you'll never be able to encourage that behavior and sustain it. So that's one of the reasons that human synergistics recognized we need to move beyond the individual level and start looking at the influence that systems and leaders have upon people and addressing some of that development toward those broader systems so that people have a chance to apply these behaviors and try more constructive things. Otherwise, it will not stick. The other thing you were touching on is, you know, we can tell people to be curious and so on, but they're just going to run out and into the street and get run over. Exactly. And that's why when we talk about culture development, you have to do two things at once. Yes, you do need to communicate the behavior you want from your people. We do want you to be curious and so on. But the second thing you must do in conjunction with that is change the system to enable and facilitate that behavior. Just telling people to be curious is not enough. They'll try, it won't be sustainable. They'll run into problems trying to do, the system will prevent them from doing that just as it has historically. That's why they're not so creative these days. What we need to do is not just tell them what we want, but we need to make systemic changes in the system to enable and facilitate and support that kind of behavior. And at best practice, you're doing this together. You're telling your people, look, we need curiosity from you because A, it's going to drive our business forward. It's consistent with our values, and that's what we need from you. But secondarily, in order to make sure you're able to do that, I, as a leader, am going to be more curious in my role. I'm going to ask you for your feedback. We're going to recognize creative ideas. We're going to get a channel of communication for our people so that when they have ideas, they have some method by which they can share them. We're going to make these changes to the system to encourage the behavior that we're requesting from you. And one of those things has to happen before the other one will. And that's very much what we need to do for unfreezing that middle. And one of those, by the way, first steps is leadership development. I think it's very hard to ask those mid-level managers to take those steps if there hasn't been done by leaders above them and not role modeled. And again, I hate to say it, but leadership impact is a phenomenal tool for cascading, because if you use that with leaders or managers at mid-level, that's great. But it's even better if their leader had used that tool 9 months ago, has been coached, has taken positive steps forward, and gets the concept so that they can literally facilitate that behavior in managers. Managers have a role model of leaders who've done this before. They've set the precedent. That's the kind of structural and leadership changes that have got to be included if we really expect management and anyone else in that system to be bold and brave enough to try to cross the road of creativity.
I just want to underline everything you just said. I think for me, this is also, there's one piece that really stays with our audience about my talk. Then really it is, out of my 10-step list, 8 items have to do with changing the context for the mid-level leaders. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
thank you.
Absolutely.
I think that's exactly the right approach.
Fantastic. Other insights, questions, please. Yeah.
You might be muted, Ali. We can't hear you, I don't think. Now, maybe?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes, indeed.
Awesome. Sabine, thank you so much for all the insights. I believe everyone needs a Sabine in her or his life, by the way. So, but that's another topic. So I wrote a couple of things down. You know, when I'm reading them, I really just want to do stuff now. So all the, this common action was the signals to the organization. So really not preaching and town hall meetings that what you want to do, but let people first feel and then try to communicate, right? The currency topic about, we have some currencies in organizations where people are, most likely it's expertise, it's business, being busy on the calendar and so on. And I really love the topic, and I'm a big fan of group dynamics when it comes to this privilege factor. One thing, and we didn't align that, Sabine, but it's really fitting well to my diary entry. I have.
And I have worked together for so many years. I think so much. That's right.
So the coolest thing I believe is one of what you have said is, prompting whenever they come, whenever they want to vent, to make sure that they find their own solution. So let them discover their own solution. And by learning that, they will bring this also back to their teams. And it's so fitting well with my diary. And you were not there at that time, but I said, this person who joined the community said, I forgot to think, because so far everyone told me what to do. So I started reflecting and I said, man, gosh, I forgot to think. That's something I have to work on. So it's really fitting well with let them discover their own solution, and still people then have a choice what to do.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Ali. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Sabine, for your content. I think I'll keep everyone on stage. We had one other topic in our schedule, which was supposed to come from my side on artificial intelligence in human synergistics report. So, however, as a result of, I think it's a good sign, a very, very positive and constructive conversation, we went a little bit over our timeline. So that's fine. I'll save the topic for our next roundtable. So we'll be doing these regularly. So thank you for all of those who joined, and we'll reach out about future roundtable sessions. And in an upcoming session, then I'll have the opportunity to illustrate our new artificial intelligence that we have basically kind of baked in to our organizational level tools, our culture instruments. So this is not just for kind of a foreshadowing. This is not a chat GPT kind of language model. This is a statistical AI that's been developed within HS for a number of years. We're just beginning to launch this with clients now. And it is designed to look at the kind of data that we're gathering in OCI and OEI, for those of you familiar, and really find the interconnections between outcomes, culture, and climate factors in a much more dynamic and sophisticated way. So we're hoping that this will really be one more level of support for our coaches and consultants such as yourselves, as well as our end user clients, to help create clarity. Organizational culture, climate, the whole system is, as we've talked about, big, dynamic, and complex. So finding I like to say, the red threads throughout that system that are most critical for us to leverage as leaders and OD development members, and really everyone, to have the biggest influence. And that's coming back to why we tend to see more success with development initiatives based on good data and information. And this really takes it a step further. So I'm really excited to be able to offer this to any of our clients who are using those instruments. This is available now. So if you'd like to see this and you're using OCI and OEI, we can generate the artificial intelligence report. It's all done online. So for those of you who are accredited, you'll be able to not only log into the online report and data platform, but you'll be able to access the artificial intelligence directly and query it based on the kind of outcome KPI performance we want to shift, and it will conduct the analysis of your client's data to identify climate factors that must be leveraged in order to influence the cultural patterns we need to drive that outcome. So it's sort of tracking the dominoes back to those which we really can and need to leverage to create that sustainable change. So it's something we've been developing for a number of years. Very, very exciting from our perspective of the value of data. It's very powerful to be able and exciting to be able to offer the next level of that information. So hopefully, if you're interested, please join us for the next roundtable, and I'll bring up the online system with a sample anonymized report, and we'll actually look at how this functions. So I think that'll bring a lot of clarity and really reinforce that, yes, in fact, we should be putting our efforts here, because again, one more indication and one more justification and reason for why those are important. Fantastic. Then I thank you all for your time. If there are any other questions from anyone, please let us know. Otherwise, I very much thank you. It's been a couple hours with us. I loved it, got a lot of energy from it. As Ali said, I want to get out there and do. So the more of this kind of interaction we have, the more I think the better for everyone. So I feel much engaged as a result, and I hope you and really everyone who had a chance to tune in does too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure meeting you, Christian, and Jochen as well. Thank you for inviting us, John.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you all. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.
Have a lovely weekend. Thank you.
Bye.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Take care.